Welcome to this journey through one of the most chilling wedding massacres in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that shattered an entire community, where a bride defied all expectations of her gender and her role, and left a legacy so horrifying that newspapers across the nation competed to capture its darkness. It was the year 1889. The Gilded Age was in full swing across America. Industrialists were building empires. Railroads connected distant corners of the continent, and vast fortunes were being made and lost in the span of a single day. But in the rural corners of Pennsylvania, in the coal mining valleys where immigrants struggled to survive, the situation was far more desperate. The small town of Lehigh Valley, nestled in the Appalachian foothills of eastern Pennsylvania, existed in a different world entirely. Here, time moved at the pace of the seasons, measured by coal production and the harsh winters that could trap families in their homes for weeks at a time. The population was a patchwork of German, Polish, and Irish immigrants who had come seeking the American dream, but found instead the suffocating darkness of coal mines and the company stores that kept them perpetually in debt. The winters here were brutal. Wind howled down from the mountains, carrying with it the smell of burning coal and industrial soot that settled on everything like a gray shroud. The landscape was scarred by mining operations, great pits carved into the earth, slag heaps rising like unnatural mountains, and the constant rumble of machinery that never truly stopped, even on Sundays when the mines were supposed to rest. In this harsh environment, where men died regularly in bins and black lung claimed those who survived the immediate dangers, women were expected to be pillars of domestic stability. They raised large families, stretched meager wages, and kept households running while their husbands descended into the earth each morning, never certain they would return. But there was one woman who did not fit this mold. Her name was Magda Richter, and she would become the most infamous bride in Pennsylvania history. Magda was born in 1863, the daughter of German immigrants who had arrived in America with dreams that quickly withered in the harsh reality of coal country. Her father, Wilhelm Richter, worked as a foreman in the Black Valley mine, a position that gave the family slightly more comfort than the average mining household, but also earned him the resentment of other workers who saw him as management's enforcer. The Richter home was a two-story wooden structure painted a fading yellow, situated on a small hill overlooking the valley. It was one of the better homes in the area, with glass windows instead of oiled paper, and a parlor where visitors could be received. But even this relative prosperity was precarious, dependent on Wilhelm's continued favor with the mine owners. Magda grew up observing the dynamics of power and resentment. She watched her father navigate the dangerous politics of the mine, seeing how he maintained authority through a combination of competence and calculated cruelty. She learned early that survival meant understanding leverage, manipulation, and the careful cultivation of fear disguised as respect. From her mother, Greta, she learned something else entirely: the art of managing a household with an iron fist hidden in a velvet glove. Greta Richter ran her home with military precision, but her control extended beyond domestic matters. She was known throughout the valley as someone who could acquire things: medicines during shortages, extra rations during hard winters, advantageous positions for family members. How she accomplished this was never discussed openly, but the other women in the community regarded her with a mixture of respect and wariness. Magda absorbed these lessons like dry earth absorbing rain. By the time she reached her 20th year, Magda had become something of an enigma in Lehigh Valley. She was striking rather than beautiful, tall for a woman of her era at 5 feet 8 inches, With dark hair she wore pulled back severely from a face dominated by pale gray eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. Her features were strong, angular, almost masculine in their severity. But it was her demeanor that truly set her apart. While other young women giggled and gossiped, Magda watched and calculated. While they dreamed of romance, she assessed potential advantages. While they hoped for love matches, she planned strategic alliances. The community found her unsettling. "There's something not right about that girl," elderly Mrs. Kowalski told her daughter-in-law one winter evening as they prepared supper. "She looks at people like she's deciding how much they're worth, like we're livestock at market." But Magda's oddness was somewhat tolerated because of her father's position and her mother's influence. In a close-knit community where survival often depended on cooperation and mutual support, alienating the Richter family was not wise. As Magda entered her mid-20s, dangerously close to being considered a spinster by the standards of the time, her parents began pressuring her to marry. Her father saw marriage as a way to cement business relationships. Her mother saw it as the natural progression of womanhood. Magda saw it as an opportunity. In the summer of 1888, a new family arrived in Lehigh Valley. The Muellers were moderately wealthy by the standards of the community. They owned a general store in town and had investments in several smaller mining operations. Their eldest son, Klaus, was 29 years old, unmarried, and by all accounts, a gentle and somewhat naive man who had spent most of his life managing the family's business interests rather than working in the mines. Klaus Mueller was exactly the kind of man Magda had been waiting for. He was well off enough to provide security, but not worldly enough to see through her carefully constructed facade. He was respected in the community, but had no particular strength of character. He was, in essence, malleable. Magda engineered their introduction with precision. She began frequenting the Mueller store, always dressed impeccably, always polite but reserved. She positioned herself as the refined daughter of a mining foreman, educated beyond the norm for the area. She could read and write in both German and English, could keep complex accounts, and had a knowledge of literature and music that impressed Klaus's mother. She allowed Klaus to pursue her while giving the impression of reluctance, of being won over gradually. She played the role of the cautious but ultimately romantic young woman, revealing calculated glimpses of warmth and affection that Klaus interpreted as her genuine feelings emerging from behind a shy exterior. In reality, Magda felt nothing for Klaus Mueller, but she felt a great deal about what marrying him would provide. Timestamp 8:00-12:00. The engagement and dark undercurrents. Klaus proposed in March of 1889, on a cold afternoon when the last snow of winter still clung to the shadowed corners of the valley. He did so in the parlor of the Richter home, with Magda's parents present, following all the proper protocols. Magda accepted with what appeared to be tears of joy. The wedding was set for June 15, 1889, a Saturday when the mines would be closed and the entire community could attend. And this was crucial to Magda's plan. The entire community would attend. In the months between the engagement and the wedding, Magda transformed. The reserved, somewhat cold woman began to display warmth and excitement. She visited with other women in the community, discussing wedding preparations, accepting advice and congratulations. She and Klaus were seen walking together through town, and witnesses reported that she seemed genuinely affectionate, holding his arm, smiling at his jokes. "I thought maybe I'd been wrong about her," Mrs. Kowalski later testified. "She seemed so happy, so normal, but there were signs for those who knew where to look." Magda began requesting unusual items through her mother's network of contacts. She ordered large quantities of certain herbs and compounds, claiming they were for pre-wedding health tonics and celebration preparations. She made inquiries about preserving foods, about fermentation processes, about the chemical properties of various substances. Her mother, Greta, if she suspected anything, said nothing. There was also the matter of the guest list. Klaus, in his generous nature, wanted to invite everyone, the entire valley, every family they knew. It would be a celebration of community, he said, a way to bring everyone together. Magda agreed enthusiastically. But she had one condition: she wanted to personally oversee the wedding feast. It was important to her, she explained, that everything be perfect. She would prepare the traditional foods, the special dishes, the celebration cakes. It was her way of honoring both her German heritage and her new family. Klaus found this charming. His mother had reservations. It was unusual for a bride to take on such responsibility, but Magda was insistent, and eventually the Müllers agreed. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Magda began preparing. She worked in the kitchen of the Richter home almost constantly, often late into the night. The smells that emanated from that kitchen were intoxicating: bread baking, meats roasting, fruits being preserved in sugar and spices. Neighbors who passed by commented on the wonderful aromas. They had no idea they were smelling their own death being prepared. June 15, 1889, dawned clear and beautiful over Lehigh Valley, the kind of day that seemed designed for celebration. The sky was a brilliant blue, unmarred by even a single cloud. Birds sang in the trees. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers from the meadows. It was perfect. The ceremony was to be held at St. Boniface Church, a modest wooden structure that served the German Catholic community. The reception would follow at the Müller property, where a large barn had been cleared and decorated for the celebration. Magda rose before dawn. She dressed carefully in her wedding gown, a creation of white silk and lace that had been imported from Philadelphia at considerable expense. It was a dress designed to project innocence, purity, and traditional femininity. When she looked at herself in the mirror, her face showed no expression whatsoever. The ceremony itself was traditional in every way. Klaus stood at the altar looking nervous and hopeful. Magda walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her face appropriately radiant, her eyes downcast in maidenly modesty. Father Hermann conducted the Mass in Latin and German, his voice echoing in the small church. The congregation, packed with nearly every resident of Lehigh Valley who could attend, watched with the mixture of sentimentality and social scrutiny that attended all weddings. "Do you, Magda Richter, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." Her voice was clear, steady, betraying nothing. Klaus's voice, when he made his own vows, shook slightly with emotion. They exchanged rings. Father Hermann blessed the union. Klaus lifted Magda's veil and kissed her gently. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers. Magda smiled. Outside the church, as the newlyweds emerged into the brilliant sunlight, the community gathered around them. Children threw flower petals. Women embraced Magda and offered blessings. Men clapped Klaus on the back and made good-natured jokes about married life. The procession to the Müller property for the reception was festive, almost jubilant. People walked in groups, talking and laughing. The hardships of coal country life were forgotten, at least for this one day. This was a time for celebration, for community, for hope. At the Müller property, long tables had been set up in and around the barn. They were covered with white cloths and decorated with wildflowers and candles. The food was already laid out, an overwhelming display of abundance in a community that rarely saw such plenty. There were roasted meats: pork, chicken, beef, There were potato dishes prepared in a dozen different ways. There were fresh breads, still warm, with butter and preserves. There were traditional German pastries, strudels and torts and pfeffernusse. There were vegetables roasted and pickled and fresh. There were cheeses and sausages and pickled eggs. And there was the wedding cake, 3 tiers of rich fruitcake, covered in white icing, decorated with sugar flowers. It was a masterpiece, the product of weeks of Magda's careful preparation. She did all this herself. Klaus's mother told guests proudly. Every dish, can you imagine such dedication? The guests marveled at the feast. They had no way of knowing that Magda had laced nearly everything with poison. The reception began with toasts. Klaus's father raised his glass of beer and offered words of wisdom about marriage. Magda's father spoke about the joining of 2 families. Various friends and relatives added their own sentiments, some heartfelt, some humorous. Magda sat at the head table, Klaus beside her, smiling and nodding at all the right moments. And then the feast began. The poison Magda had chosen was arsenic specifically, arsenious acid, commonly known as white arsenic. In 1889, arsenic was shockingly easy to obtain. It was sold in general stores as rat poison. It was used in wallpapers and fabrics to create certain green dyes. It was even present in some medicines and cosmetics. Magda had been acquiring small amounts for months, using various pretexts, ensuring no single purchase would raise suspicion. Arsenic has certain properties that made it ideal for Magda's purpose. It is tasteless when mixed with food. It causes symptoms that can be mistaken for food poisoning or gastric illness. And most importantly, when distributed across a large amount of food in carefully calculated doses, it can affect numerous people simultaneously. But Magda had done something more sophisticated than simple poisoning. She had prepared different foods with different concentrations. The main dishes, the ones everyone would eat, contained enough arsenic to cause severe illness, painful symptoms, but not immediate death. The wedding cake, however, which traditionally the bride and groom would cut and serve to honored guests, contained a much higher concentration. And there was one more element to her plan. She had prepared a special plate of food for Klaus, her new husband. This plate, which she served to him personally with loving attention, contained no poison whatsoever. Klaus would survive. He would survive to witness what his bride had done. The guests ate with enthusiasm, complimenting the food, calling for recipes, praising Magda's culinary skills. Children ran between tables, playing games, their mouths sticky with pastry cream. Men drank beer and told stories. Women gathered in groups to discuss the ceremony and admire Magda's dress. It was approximately 1 hour after the feast began when the first guest collapsed. Johann Schneider, a mine worker in his 40s, was in mid-sentence when he suddenly clutched his stomach. His face went pale, then flushed red. He made a choking sound and vomited violently onto the ground. At first, people thought he had simply drunk too much beer too quickly. But then his wife began exhibiting the same symptoms, and their daughter, and the couple sitting across from them. Within minutes, the festive atmosphere transformed into chaos. People throughout the reception area were suddenly, violently ill. The symptoms came on like a wave: intense abdominal cramping, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. The pain was described by survivors as excruciating, like knives twisting in their stomachs. Some victims tried to reach the house, seeking privacy or help. Others collapsed where they sat. Children screamed, not understanding what was happening, seeing their parents writhing in agony. The smell of vomit and human waste filled the air, mixing grotesquely with the earlier pleasant aromas of the feast. Klaus Mueller stood frozen in horror, watching the carnage unfold around him. He felt fine. He had eaten from the special plate Magda had prepared. But everyone else was suffering. "What's happening?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Someone get the doctor." But the doctor. Friedrich Lange was among those suffering, on his knees by one of the tables, his medical bag forgotten as his own body betrayed him. And in the midst of this nightmare, Magda sat at the head table, completely calm, completely untouched. She had not eaten anything from the communal feast. Klaus turned to his bride, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. "Magda, why aren't you sick? Why aren't you eating?" She met his eyes with that pale gray stare that had always unsettled people. "Because I know what's in the food, Klaus." For a moment he didn't comprehend. The human mind resists certain truths, especially when they're too monstrous to process. You knew the food was bad. Why didn't you warn everyone? Bad. She smiled, and it was perhaps the most genuinely joyful expression anyone had ever seen on her face. "Not bad, Klaus. Perfect. Everything is going exactly as I planned." The realization hit him like a physical blow. "You did this. You poisoned everyone, your own wedding guests, my family, your family, our families." She corrected him calmly. "Your parents, my parents, your siblings, my cousins, everyone who ever looked at me like I was wrong, everyone who whispered about me, everyone who judged me, everyone who tried to force me into their mold of what a woman should be." Around them, people were dying. Mrs. Kowalski, the elderly woman who had questioned Magda's character, lay on the ground, her body convulsing. Young children, innocent of any crime except being present, cried for mothers who could no longer help them. Strong men who survived the dangers of the mines daily were reduced to writhing, screaming victims. Klaus tried to move, tried to go help someone, anyone, but Magda grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "You'll stay here," she said. "You'll watch. You need to understand what you've married. You're a monster." He whispered. "No," she replied. "I'm just tired of pretending to be something I'm not." The death toll mounted rapidly. The arsenic, combined with the panic and the lack of any effective medical intervention, worked efficiently. Bodies that had been laughing and celebrating an hour earlier now lay still. The sounds of agony gradually lessened as victims either lost consciousness or succumbed entirely. By the time authorities arrived, alerted by a servant boy who had been working in the main house and ran to town when he witnessed the horror, 2 people were dead or dying. 2 human beings, ranging in age from 4 to 71. An entire community decimated at a wedding feast. And Magda Richter Mueller sat calmly at the head table, her white wedding dress pristine and unstained, waiting to be arrested. Sheriff Thomas Brennan arrived at the Mueller property with 3 deputies, expecting perhaps a brawl or a drunken dispute, the usual troubles at large gatherings. What he found was a scene from hell. Bodies lay scattered across the property. Some were clearly dead, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. Others were still moving weakly, moaning beyond help. The smell was overwhelming: vomit, excrement, death, and underneath it all, the now sickening sweet smell of the feast foods. Brennan, a veteran of the Civil War who had seen battlefields, later said that this was worse. At least in war, you expect death. This was supposed to be a celebration. He found Klaus Mueller sitting on the ground near the head table, his face blank with shock, rocking slightly back and forth. And sitting beside him, completely composed, was the bride. "Are you responsible for this?" Brennan asked Magda directly. "Yes," she replied without hesitation. The sheriff was so shocked by her calm admission that he momentarily forgot protocol. "Why, in God's name, why?" Does it matter? She stood, smoothing her dress. The deed is done. The reason changes nothing. She offered her wrists for the shackles without resistance. As the deputies led her away, she turned back once to look at the carnage, at the bodies being covered with sheets, at the survivors being tended to by those few who had not eaten, at her husband, still sitting in shocked silence. Her expression showed no remorse, only satisfaction. The investigation that followed was relatively straightforward. Magda offered a complete confession, detailing exactly how she had acquired the arsenic, how she had prepared the food, how she had calculated the doses. She explained her reasoning with the same calm detachment she had shown at the scene. They wanted to make me into something I wasn't. She told investigators. My parents wanted an obedient daughter. Klaus wanted a docile wife. The community wanted a proper woman. I was tired of the pretense, and I wanted them to understand that they couldn't force people to be what they're not without consequences. So you killed them, the prosecutor asked during one interrogation. Children, elderly people who had done nothing to you. They were part of the system, she replied. And systems need to be destroyed completely, or they rebuild themselves. The psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Ernest Whitmore, a specialist brought in from Philadelphia, concluded that Magda was both highly intelligent and completely devoid of normal human empathy. She understood right and wrong intellectually, but felt no emotional connection to moral concepts. This is the most calculating mind I have ever encountered, Dr. Whitmore wrote in his report. Mrs. Mueller shows no remorse, no guilt, no recognition of her actions as wrong beyond an intellectual understanding that society views them as crimes. When asked if she would have done anything differently, she replied that she would have used a faster-acting poison to avoid giving any victims the chance to alert others. The physical evidence supported every detail of Magda's confession. Chemical analysis of the remaining food revealed high concentrations of arsenic in nearly every dish. The wedding cake, in particular, contained enough poison to kill dozens. Klaus Mueller, the surviving groom, deteriorated rapidly after the tragedy. He never testified at the trial. His mind had fractured under the horror of what he had witnessed. He was committed to a sanitarium and died there 3 years later, never having spoken coherently again after the day of his wedding. The death toll ultimately reached 47 people. 5 additional victims succumbed to the poison in the days following the massacre, their organs too damaged to recover. 47 lives ended at a wedding celebration. The trial of Magda Richter Mueller began on September 2, 1889, less than 3 months after the wedding massacre. It was held in the county courthouse in Allentown, as local authorities feared no impartial jury could be found in Lehigh Valley, where nearly every family had been affected by the tragedy. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Charles Morrison, an experienced trial lawyer who had handled numerous murder cases, but nothing on this scale. The defense attorney was appointed by the court. No lawyer would voluntarily take the case, and Harold Bingham found himself in the impossible position of defending the indefensible. The courtroom was packed every day. Spectators came from across Pennsylvania and even from neighboring states, drawn by the sensational nature of the crime. Newspapers competed for the most lurid headlines. Artists sketched scenes from the trial for publications across the country. And through it all, Magda sat calmly at the defense table, dressed in simple black, her face showing no emotion whatsoever. Bingham's defense strategy was based on insanity. It was the only possible approach. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said in his opening statement, no sane person could commit such an act. The very nature of this crime proves that my client was not in her right mind. We will show that Magda Mueller suffered from a profound mental illness that prevented her from understanding the moral weight of her actions. But this defense crumbled under cross-examination. Dr. Whitmore testified about his evaluation. Mrs. Mueller demonstrates perfect rational thinking. She planned this crime over months with careful attention to detail. She understood consequences. She ensured her own survival and that of her husband specifically to maximize the impact of her actions. This is not insanity. This is sociopathy. She knows right from wrong. She simply doesn't care. The prosecution called survivors to testify. Those who had been too sick to eat much, or who had arrived late to the reception and hadn't yet consumed the poisoned food, described the horror in devastating detail. Thomas Werner, who had lost his wife and 2 young sons, broke down on the stand. "My boys, they were so happy, playing with the other children, and then they started screaming the pain. I couldn't help them. I couldn't save them. I watched my children die, and there was nothing I could do." The courtroom wept. The jury wept. Magda showed no reaction. When asked if she wished to testify in her own defense, she declined. But she did submit a written statement that was read aloud to the court. "I do not deny what I have done. I planned it carefully and executed it successfully. I do not claim insanity or diminished capacity. I knew exactly what I was doing and why. Society constructs rules and roles, particularly for women, that are prisons. We are told to be gentle, nurturing, submissive, self-sacrificing. We are told our purpose is to serve others' fathers, husbands, children. We are told to accept this without question, to find joy in our own subordination. I refused to accept this. I wanted to demonstrate that the expectations placed upon women are not just unfair, but dangerous. When you force people to suppress their true nature, when you demand conformity, you create monsters. I am what society made me. This massacre is the logical conclusion of your rules." The statement was met with outrage. Several spectators had to be removed from the courtroom for shouting. One man tried to rush the defense table before being restrained by bailiffs. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on 47 counts of first-degree murder. When the verdict was read, Magda's expression didn't change. She stood calmly as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. Judge Marcus Whitfield, a man known for his measured temperament, struggled to maintain his composure as he addressed the defendant. "Magda Mueller, in my 30 years on the bench, I have never encountered a crime of this magnitude or a criminal as devoid of human feeling as yourself. You have murdered 47 innocent people, including children, including your own parents, with no more concern than if you were exterminating vermin. The law provides only one appropriate punishment for such heinous acts." He paused, looking directly at her. "You are hereby sentenced to death by hanging. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court has none." Magda met his gaze steadily. "I don't want mercy," she said clearly. "I want to be remembered." And she was. Magda was transferred to the women's section of Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, where she would await execution. The prison, with its imposing stone walls and revolutionary separate system design, was intended to encourage reflection and repentance. Magda did neither. During her incarceration, she received hundreds of letters. Some were from people expressing outrage and hatred. Others were from individuals, particularly women, who saw her as a symbol of rebellion against oppressive social structures. These letters disturbed authorities more than the hate mail did. A small but vocal movement emerged arguing that Magda's actions, while criminal, revealed important truths about the treatment of women in society. Several prominent suffragettes, including some associated with Elizabeth Cady Stanton's circle, wrote opinion pieces arguing that the case should prompt reflection on women's limited options and Psychological effects of gender oppression. These arguments were roundly condemned by mainstream society, but they added a complex dimension to the public discourse surrounding the case. Magda herself gave one interview during her imprisonment to a female journalist from the Philadelphia Inquirer named Catherine Wells. The interview, published in November of 1889, provides perhaps the most unfiltered look at Magda's psychology. When asked if she felt any remorse, Magda replied, "Remorse requires you to believe you've done something wrong. I don't. I believe I've done something necessary. If my actions shock you, perhaps you should examine the conditions that created someone like me." When asked about the children who died, she said, "Children are not innocent. They are future adults who will perpetuate the same systems that oppress others. Every child at that feast would have grown up to enforce the same rules, to judge and constrain others as I was judged and constrained." The interview created another wave of outrage. Throughout her imprisonment, Magda maintained the same calm demeanor she had shown at the wedding. Guards reported that she ate well, slept soundly, and showed no signs of anxiety or distress. She spent her time reading. She requested books on philosophy, particularly works dealing with moral philosophy and the nature of evil. She requested, and was denied, access to scientific texts about poisons and toxicology. The execution was scheduled for March 3, 1890, at dawn. As the date approached, there were protests both for and against carrying out the sentence. Some argued that executing Magda would make her a martyr for radical causes. Others argued that anything less than execution would be a betrayal of the 47 victims. The execution proceeded as scheduled. On the morning of March 3rd, Magda was led from her cell to the gallows that had been erected in the prison yard. She wore a simple gray dress, and her hair was unbound, falling to her shoulders, the only time since her arrest that anyone had seen her with her hair down. She walked to the gallows without assistance, her steps steady. The small group of official witnesses gathered, required by law, but clearly uncomfortable with their role. The warden, the prison chaplain, representatives from the district attorney's office, and the executioner himself, a professional who traveled between prisons conducting hangings. Father O'Brien, the prison chaplain, offered to pray with Magda. She declined politely. "I don't believe in your God, Father, and if he exists, he made me what I am. So really, this is between him and himself." She was asked if she had any final words. Magda looked at the witnesses, at the prison walls, at the brightening sky beyond them where morning was breaking. "I have no regrets," she said clearly, "and I would do it again." The hood was placed over her head. The noose was positioned around her neck. The trapdoor was released. Magda Richter Mueller died at 7 in the morning on March 3, 1890. She was 26 years old. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, and no family members claimed her remains. The wedding massacre left scars on Lehigh Valley that took generations to heal. Entire families had been wiped out. Children were left orphaned. The Mueller family business collapsed. No one wanted to patron a store associated with such horror. The property where the massacre occurred was eventually burned to the ground by community members who couldn't bear to look at it anymore. St. Boniface Church, where Magda and Klaus had taken their vows, saw attendance drop dramatically. Father Herman, who had conducted the wedding ceremony, never fully recovered from the guilt he felt, wondering if he should have somehow sensed the evil in Magda's heart. He died 2 years later of what the death certificate listed as heart failure, but what everyone knew was a broken spirit. The psychological impact rippled through the community for decades. Survivors suffered what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares, couldn't eat without anxiety, startled at loud sounds. Several committed suicide in the years following the massacre. And there was the question that haunted everyone: could it have been prevented? Looking back at Magda's life, there were signs. The coldness, the calculating nature, the lack of genuine emotional connection with others. But in 1889, there was limited understanding of psychology, and particularly of personality disorders. What we might now diagnose as antisocial personality disorder was simply seen as bad character or wickedness. Her mother, Greta Richter, one of the victims, had perhaps known her daughter best. In letters discovered after her death, she wrote to a sister in Germany expressing concerns about Magda's nature. "She is like a mirror," Greta wrote. "She reflects what you expect to see, but there's nothing behind the reflection. She performs emotions without feeling them. I have raised a beautiful, intelligent shell of a person, and I don't know if there's anything truly human inside." These letters raised troubling questions about parental responsibility and the nature versus nurture debate that would continue for generations. The case also sparked broader discussions about women's roles in society. While most people rejected any justification for Magda's actions, some feminist writers and thinkers used the case to highlight the pressures placed on women and the limited acceptable outlets: female ambition and agency. An essay published in 1890, one by writer and activist Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who would later write The Yellow Wallpaper, discussed the case in the context of how society's rigid gender expectations could warp human psychology. While condemning the murders, she argued that creating a society where women had genuine choices and agency might prevent the kind of psychological damage that could manifest in extreme ways. The criminal justice system also grappled with the case. It was one of the first times a woman had been executed for mass murder in the United States, and it raised questions about gender, punishment, and the death penalty. Some argued that executing Magda was necessary to demonstrate that women were equally accountable under law. Others argued that it revealed society's hypocrisy. Men who committed similar crimes often received more lenient treatment, and executing a woman was still shocking to Victorian sensibilities. The forensic aspects of the case also advanced criminology. The careful chemical analysis of the food and the methodical documentation of Magda's planning became a case study for investigators. It was one of the early examples of what would eventually be called mass murder, as distinct from serial killing, the murder of multiple victims in a single event. In the decades following the massacre, Lehigh Valley slowly rebuilt. New families moved in. The mines continued operating. Life, as it must, went on, but the community never forgot. For years afterward, June 15th was treated as a day of mourning. Businesses closed. Families gathered to remember the dead. Children were told the story as a cautionary tale, though the exact nature of what they should be cautious about remained unclear. Be careful of quiet people. Be wary of women who don't fit societal molds. Question authority and tradition. Trust your instincts about others. The lessons were as ambiguous as they were disturbing. Despite Magda's detailed confession and the thorough investigation, questions remained that were never fully answered. The primary mystery: why that specific method, at that specific time? Magda could have killed Klaus alone if she simply wanted to escape an unwanted marriage. She could have fled before the wedding. She could have refused to marry entirely, regardless of social pressure. But she chose to create a massacre, to destroy an entire community's celebration, to traumatize the survivors with the memory of death at a wedding feast, a perversion of one of humanity's most ancient and sacred rituals. Psychological experts have debated this for over a century. Some argue she wanted maximum impact, to not just kill, but to destroy meaning, to corrupt something joyful into something horrific. Others suggest it was about control and power. She orchestrated every detail, from the guest list to the menu to the timing, demonstrating complete mastery over life and death. Dr. Robert Hare, the modern psychologist who developed the psychopathy checklist, studied historical cases including Magda's. He suggested that for someone with her psychological profile, the planning and execution of the massacre may have been more important than the killing itself. It was a demonstration of superiority, of being able to manipulate an entire community into celebrating their own deaths. There's also the question of her mother's role. Greta Richter died at the feast, but her letters suggest she understood something was fundamentally wrong with her daughter. Did she suspect what Magda was planning? Could she have stopped it? Some researchers have suggested that Greta's network of connections, her ability to acquire unusual items, may have actually facilitated Magda's access to arsenic. Whether this was knowing complicity or unwitting assistance remains unknown. And then there's Klaus. Why did Magda ensure he survived? She claimed it was so he would understand what he had married. But psychological analysis suggests a more complex motivation. By making him the sole surviving witness, by forcing him to watch everyone he loved die while he remained untouched, she created a living testimony to her power. His subsequent mental collapse could be seen as the final murder, killing his mind while leaving his body alive. The question that perhaps troubles people most deeply is one of detection and prevention. Could anyone have known what Magda was? Could anyone have stopped her? Modern psychological profiling suggests that individuals like Magda often show signs from early childhood: cruelty to animals, inability to form genuine bonds, lack of empathy. But in the context of 1880s Pennsylvania, where survival was hard and emotional distance was sometimes necessary, would such signs have been recognized? Moreover, Magda was exceptionally intelligent and highly skilled at manipulation. She understood social expectations and could mimic appropriate responses. She could perform emotions convincingly enough to fool even those closest to her for extended periods. This raises uncomfortable questions about the limits of human perception and the masks that intelligent predators can wear. The story of Magda Richter Mueller remains one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history, not just because of the body count, but because of what it reveals about human nature and the facades we present to the world. In the century and more since the massacre, criminal psychology has advanced dramatically. We now have frameworks for understanding personality disorders, psychopathy, and the various forms mental illness can take. We have diagnostic tools and, theoretically, intervention strategies. But cases like Magda's remind us that knowledge has limits. She was intelligent enough to understand exactly what society wanted her to be, and skilled enough to perform that role flawlessly when necessary. She used society's own expectations, that women were nurturing, that brides were innocent, that someone preparing a feast was expressing love, as camouflage for her true nature. In this way, Magda's case speaks to something beyond its specific historical moment. It speaks to the persistent human difficulty in recognizing evil when it wears a familiar face, when it meets our expectations, when it tells us what we want to hear. The wedding guests saw a bride in white, surrounded by food she had lovingly prepared, celebrating her marriage. They saw exactly what they expected to see, and that's what killed them. There's a broader, philosophical question embedded in this case. To what extent are monsters made by society, and to what extent are they born? Magda herself claimed she was created by social constraints, that her actions were a logical response to oppression. But this self-serving narrative ignores the reality that countless women faced similar or worse constraints without becoming mass murderers. The truth is likely more complex. Magda may have been born with a psychological makeup that made empathy and genuine connection impossible. But she was also shaped by a society that gave women few acceptable outlets for ambition and power. The combination created something devastating. This doesn't excuse her actions. Understanding causes is not the same as justification. 47 innocent people died horrible deaths because of choices Magda made consciously and deliberately. But it does suggest that we must be vigilant both in recognizing warning signs in individuals and in examining the social structures that might channel destructive impulses into catastrophic actions. The Wedding Massacre of 1889 stands as a reminder that evil is not always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it sits calmly at a wedding feast, dressed in white, smiling as the world dies around it. To this day, there are remnants of the tragedy scattered through Pennsylvania. The cemetery in Lehigh Valley contains a section where 42 of the victims are buried together, a mass grave marked by a simple stone monument listing their names and the date of death. The inscription reads, "Taken suddenly from life's celebration. May they find peace beyond this world's cruelty." Local historians maintain records of the case, and occasionally, researchers visit to study the trial transcripts and contemporary newspaper accounts. The case appears in criminal psychology textbooks, usually in sections dealing with female murderers or mass poisoning cases. In 1893, a small book was published anonymously titled Reflections on the Mueller Wedding Massacre. It was later discovered to be written by Catherine Wells, the journalist who interviewed Magda. In it, she grapples with her own complex reaction to meeting someone so devoid of normal human feeling. "She was like a void in human form," Wells wrote. "Talking to her was like talking to a mirror that reflected everything but revealed nothing. I left that interview feeling cold, as if something essential to my own humanity had been temporarily questioned just by proximity to her complete absence of it." The property where the massacre occurred remained empty for decades. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, it was finally redeveloped, but the buildings constructed there have had unusually high turnover. People report feeling uncomfortable, though whether this is psychological knowledge of the site's history or something more is impossible to say. There are, inevitably, ghost stories. People claim to hear the sounds of celebration, music, laughter, the clink of glasses. On June 15th evenings, others report seeing a woman in a white dress walking through the area where the barn once stood. These stories are likely folklore built on trauma, the community's collective unconscious still processing the horror. But they persist. In academic circles, the case continues to generate debate. Criminologists analyze Magda's planning methods. Historians examine the case in the context of gender roles and social expectations in the late 19th century. Psychologists use it as a teaching example for discussing personality disorders and the nature of psychopathy. A doctoral thesis written in 2003 by a researcher at Penn State analyzed newspaper coverage of the case and found interesting patterns in how Magda was described. Male journalists tended to emphasize her unnaturalness, how she violated expected gender norms. Female journalists, while condemning her actions, sometimes included more nuanced analysis of the social pressures she faced. This difference in framing reveals how the case served as a kind of Rorschach test for attitudes about women, power, and violence. The most recent academic interest has come from researchers studying the intersection of true crime, public fascination with female killers, and the ways society narrativizes evil. Magda's case is often compared to other infamous female murderers, Belle Gunness, Jane Tappan, Dorothea Puente women who used traditionally feminine roles and settings as camouflage for their crimes. What distinguishes Magda is perhaps her honesty about her own motivations and her refusal to claim insanity or diminished capacity. She owned her actions completely, and in doing so, she denied society the comfort of simple explanations. And on silent nights, when the wind moves through the valleys of eastern Pennsylvania, carrying with it the smell of coal dust and old earth, people still tell the story of the bride who murdered every guest at her wedding. They tell it as a warning, though what exactly they're warning against has never been quite clear. Perhaps that's the most disturbing thing of all. If this journey through one of history's most calculated acts of mass murder resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the nature of evil that hides behind familiar faces, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined with the care and depth they demand. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own perspectives on this question. Can we ever truly know the people around us, or are we all, to some degree, mysteries even to those who love us? What created Magda Richter Mueller? Was she born without the capacity for empathy, or did society's rigid expectations break something essential in her soul? The answer matters less than the questions themselves, and the reminder that evil often wears the most ordinary faces. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and remember, the darkest mysteries are often hidden in plain sight. This is the Untold Hour.